Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Making the Argument. Today, we have a special guest on because we're going to be talking about a very important topic, but we're going to be hitting it from a couple of different angles that I would argue are not commonly discussed. So whenever we talk about the status of family in the United States right now, and really the West in general, I think we all recognize that there have been some problems. There have been some issues. And the question is, why? And a lot of people have ideas, whether it be, left-wing ideology or maybe aspects of the way we think about sex and relationships. But I don't know that many people make the connections that we actually need to understand the origins of these theories around the sexual revolution, around gender ideology, around transgenderism. All of it is not some grassroots effort that just organically happened over time because a bunch of people looked around and decided that this was the way we needed to reorganize society. No, a lot of this was pushed. And my guest today, Dr. Jennifer Morse from the Ruth Institute, has spent a lot of time thinking about these issues, researching these issues, not just from an economic perspective, but from somebody that at one point in her life probably would have agreed with some of it. So, Dr. Morse, great to have you on again on Making the Argument.
Nick, so glad to be on your show again. And it was so great to see you at the Live Action Conference a few months ago. So I'm really happy to talk with you about these things.
When that Live Action Conference is kind of what inspired me to want to have this discussion again, because last time we talked about a variety of issues with respect to relationships and whatnot, but you made a comment, and I'm not going to tell what the audience it is yet, right? I want to wait till this. You made a comment. It was on one of your slides. I was like, oh my gosh. Yes. This does the best job of kind of explaining where things are going and why things have gone in this direction and why, if left unchecked, it's going to get much worse. People think that the height of this, equity revolution, gender equity revolution, I think they think, the whole transgender, men and women's spaces, sexually, mutilating minors in order to try to have them chase this unattainable idea or concept that they can somehow change their sex or gender. That's got to be the worst level of this, and it isn't. And that blows people's minds. So, could you walk us through a little bit some of the things that you discussed at Live Action regarding the sexual state and this idea of the sexual revolution and the impact it's had on society?
Sure. So let me start by telling your audience that Live Action has all of our talks posted. And I was there last year as well as this year. And the talks are very similar. But the first year we were there in 2023, you and I were there for that inaugural one. That one shows the slides. The ones that this year, they don't have the slides. It's just me standing there talking. So if you want to see the slides, you should look at the first one. But also we have all this at the Ruth Institute on our YouTube channel, so you can get the whole thing. But yeah, here's a brief overview way to see it, Nick. And that is, ask yourself this: is transgenderism a grassroots movement? Was all of a sudden people looked around and said, you know what society really needs is the ability for people to change sex and to have the sex of the body simply be irrelevant for law, irrelevant for policy. What really matters is how you feel about it. Did that really come from the grassroots? And I think anybody who's been halfway awake is aware that this has been pushed from the top down upon society, and that the typical average normal person looks around and goes, what the heck is going on? And doesn't want anything to do with it. And you can especially see that since President Trump took office and he took out the federal support of it. Okay. And by taking out the federal support of it, you can look around and go, criminy, it was everywhere. The federal government was doing an amazing amount of particularly propaganda work in the schools. There were like a whole list of things in that original executive order that he put out. There was a whole list of things that the federal government's not going to do anymore. And the longest list had to do with what was being taught in the schools and that was being promoted through the federal Department of Education. Okay.
Well, so, and can I say something real quick on that? Because I think this is important, right? A lot of the attention that like the work, we've done a lot of research on Doge and what Doge has been doing. And obviously some of the most like ridiculous things we saw were talking about DEI programs, right? Or it was talking about funding trans operas in Colombia, right, or a comic book in Peru, or LGBTQ advocacy in, sub-Saharan Africa. And so this was not just something that was being exported through USAID. This was something that was being pushed from the federal government using your tax dollars through the university system and even into your public school system.
Correct. That is exactly right. So, and USAID, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that because USAID, I think everybody understands now that was a money laundering operation, if we could just be bold enough to say that. And a lot of what they were laundering was propaganda for the sexual revolution. And that's been true for a long time. Okay. And so if we want to now go and say, I'm putting that out there because hopefully everyone can see that, right? You can see this is a top-down creation. And what I argue in my book, The Sexual State, which I have on the shelf behind me there, what I argue is that the whole of the sexual revolution has been a top-down imposition by the elite ruling class for reasons of their own, okay? And we can go through what those reasons might be.
But while we do that, can we say something real quick? And that is when we say sexual revolution, are like if we had to broadly categorize that, what would be the core characteristics?
Yeah. When I say the sexual revolution, people mean a lot of different things when they use this term. And so, I mean, I think this is, you mentioned that I'm an economist. I taught at George Mason University. So those of you who are there in Northern Virginia, you know what the Mason, I was there when James Buchanan was there, and the whole public choice center and all of that kind of thing. One thing that you do in economics is you define your terms. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so there's no blithering around, and kind of slinking away by changing the meaning of words as you're going around. So the way I define the sexual revolution, Nick, is this way. I say there are three interlocking ideologies. And none of these ideologies are exactly Marxist, but they have a relationship to Marxism that I know you want to talk about. Let me just put out what the three ideologies are so people can see when I say it, this is what I mean. Other people are yammering all over the place saying other things. Half the time they don't know exactly what they mean. But here's what I mean, okay?
Okay, so before we jump into this, one of the things that we have to acknowledge right off the bat is that if you're someone that enjoys good food and protein, well, then you need to head over to Good Ranchers, because Good Ranchers produces some of the best American-raised beef, pork, poultry, and wild-caught seafood you will ever have delivered directly to your door. And if you go over there right now, if you go to goodranchers.com and use my code NICK, you're going to get free meat with your order. That's right. You go on there, you get your subscription, you order, and they've got all kinds of subscriptions. They're specifically tailored to your culinary delight. But on top of just providing you a great product, they're also going to give you free of your choice. You can choose Wagyu burgers, which we have all the time, and are delicious.
They're so good. I'll eat them by themselves. They're so good.
Wagyu burgers, hot dogs now, bacon, or chicken wings in every box. And by the way, when they talk about like chicken wings, when they talk about their chicken nuggets, stuff like that, that is seed oil free chicken nuggets. Plus, because you used my code, you're going to get an extra $40 off. So if you want to support a truly great company that provides a truly great product delivered directly to your door right in time for summer, for Mother's Day, for Father's Day, all that good stuff. GoodRanchers.com. Use my code Nick and get all those advantages. I promise you are not going to be disappointed. We eat Good Ranchers almost every day.
So the sexual revolution has three interlocking ideologies. The first one is that a good and decent society should do everything possible to separate sex from babies. Okay. Now think about that. Sex is to be a recreational activity with no reproductive consequences. If you happen to have quirky lifestyle preferences and you want to have a child or two, but nothing crazy, maybe two, you can if you really want. But basically, we're going to see sex as a normally and normatively sterile activity. Okay.
Okay.
That, right. And if you think about it, oh yeah, that's what we think. And but if you take a step back from it, you go, that's actually quite weird. I
Yeah.
mean, that's not a normal conclusion that any society has ever drawn before.
Well, so let me ask you something. Let me ask you something about that, because obviously, I mean, the idea is not that you have to have a baby every time you have sex, right? Like,
Right.
and I think that most people would say, well, look, there are, relationship benefits and health benefits and everything else as a result of having that, which doesn't include reproduction. So are you saying that, are you saying that it is improper to look at the sexual act, apart from reproduction? Or are you saying that, of course, we should realize that one of the core functions of sex is reproduction?
Yeah, closer to the second. Okay,
Okay.
my position closer to what you just said. It's not that there were a few religious sects that taught that you had to have as many children as possible. One of the Anabaptist sects thought that, and demographers still study them to figure out what natural maximum fertility looks like. Because
Yeah.
they literally taught that. But Christianity doesn't teach that, has never taught that. But the reality is that one of the organic purposes of human sexuality is reproduction.
Yeah.
Another organic purpose of human sexuality is spousal unity, spousal bonding, right? Because you attach to your sex partner. This is the most natural thing in the world. Now, an evolutionary biologist might say, oh, there's survival value if mom and dad are attached to each other. That helps the baby survive. Good, that's fine. As you and I as Christians would say, that Almighty God built this into our bodies so that we would, number one, enjoy reproducing, enjoy being part of the procreative process, because God does the creation. He's involved us in his process for reasons known to him. He has set up the world in this manner so that men and women come together and procreate, bring forth new life, so that every human life comes into existence as the result of an act of love. Right? That's what God wants for us. He wants that for everybody. And so for you and I, we would say, well, boy, that should be at the center of whatever social institutions we create around. I don't even want to call it reproduction. Reproduction is what animals do. Procreation is what humans do, right?
Okay.
Because it has the element of it connects us to the divine purpose, to use the term procreation as opposed to reproduction. Which animals do in our thinking. So you see what I mean?
Yeah. So step one is, what we might call, certainly the Christian worldview, and what was probably considered kind of the traditional, worldview for most of human history, was this idea that sex its only purpose was not to have kids, but it was a primary purpose, and the two cannot be fundamentally separated. And the step one that you're describing of the sexual revolution was to say, no, there should not be any inherent connection between sex and reproduction as a meaningful or necessary component of sex.
We don't have to take that into account.
Got it. That's a great way to put it. Okay.
And so if you look back at the history of it, the people who really promoted this, and I can tell you the exact moment when it happened, Nick, in 1930, the Lambeth Convention meeting of the Episcopalian Anglican Church, the Anglican Church is what they call themselves, they were the first Christian group to say, maybe contraception isn't so bad for a married couple that has a serious reason. But up until that time, everybody was like, no, you can't do that, because they understood that it would change all the incentives for people's behavior, and you'd be disincentivizing the one place where you really need, you need to have mom and dad connected, because they might become mom and dad, and so that's why the sort of natural priority for sex belonging inside the marital act, which of course Jesus was very clear about that, right? No question about that. No question in the Jewish tradition on which we're based, and so on. And so behind the Lambeth Convention, behind the Episcopalians or the Anglicans doing that, was the eugenics movement and the population control movement. Margaret Sanger was back there whispering in their ears, Nick, telling them, there are too many people in the world. There's too many of the wrong kind of people in the world, and so therefore we must do something about that. And their solution was originally birth control and then, of course, abortion, because once you create the idea that non-procreative sex is okay, you got to have abortion as a backup plan, and that, I mean, I know a lot of people don't think that, but as a matter of sociological, historical fact, that's how it's gone, right? You can't plant that idea and not have abortion as a backup plan.
Yeah, no, I've gotten really tired of people misapplying the slippery slope fallacy, essentially saying that if I can logically conclude that this will end in a particular, like this is the logical outworking of a particular ideology, that I'm engaging in slippery slope reasoning. It's like, well, no. Slippery slope, properly understood, is I'm not saying this has to happen. I'm saying it is a logical conclusion that if I separate this concept of procreation from sex, if I say that, no, the goal should be to look at sex as its own independent act, separate from this. And if this thing happens as a result of sex, that can be now seen as, just a negative thing or an unfortunate incident that is now infringing on this act that I'm using for all of these other purposes. Right. So that's kind of like step one in the sexual revolution. What's the next one?
Correct. And I think your audience can already see how deep this goes, right? Because the whole population control issue is in play. The whole Alfred Kinsey movement is in play. Alfred Kinsey is all about. There were a number of guys like this. It's not fair to put it all on Kinsey, but there were people with the theory that you absolutely have to have sex in order to have a normal psyche. You'll be crazy if you don't have sex, and which is actually how addicts think if you really stop and think about it, right? I mean, no one's ever medical fact. No one has ever died from not having sex. Okay, I'm just going to put
just
that
don't tell my wife and we'll be fine. Okay. Right.
It's just necessary to have some limits on the sexual urge, right? But anyway, so that's the first big idea that people need to kind of wrap your mind around. And the second big idea is the idea that we should also separate both sex and babies from marriage. That marriage is not necessary to be the place where sex takes place. So in the early days of promoting contraception, it was always promoted this way. It would say a married couple with serious health reasons, they should be allowed to purchase or do whatever. That was the regulation that was at stake in the first Supreme Court case in Griswold versus Connecticut. Married couple with serious health reasons. And a lot of people, like ordinary people, are like, well, wait a minute, what if unmarried people start using it? Isn't that going to cause some problems? It's like, yeah, like the little old ladies who are writing into their legislatures, we don't think this is a good idea, kind of thing. Well, they were right. So now I call that idea, the idea that sex and marriage and babies are disconnected. Both sex and babies can be had outside of marriage. I refer to that as the divorce ideology.
Okay.
Because it includes not just divorce itself, but anything that separates a child from one of their parents. And let's face it, the whole sociological point of marriage is to keep mom and dad together for a lifetime, because this is what Junior needs in order to thrive. Junior doesn't really care how mom and dad are getting along in the bedroom. Kids don't really care. There's a lot of stuff they don't care about.
Yeah.
But they need us to be there for them so that when they're 5 years old, they can do all the developmental tasks that a 5-year-old needs to do without worrying about whether mom and dad are going to go to family court and he's going to end up living somewhere else.
Well, I think it's fascinating too, because I'm old enough to remember, and look, my parents got divorced at 3. Dad got remarried, going through another divorce. Mom got remarried, got divorced. So I've been around a lot of divorce growing up, right? But what was interesting is I remember, now what was different was my parents never treated the divorce like it was a blessing or a great thing. They treated it like it was a failure. right?
Yeah.
They treat it. And so even though I grew up with divorce, I never had it like romanticized or anything like that.
Right.
And thankfully I had parents that were both still, actively involved in my life and generally supportive of one another when it came to parental decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always say that like divorce is just bad. It's just bad. I'm tired of people wanting to give 1,000 different caveats. Yes, we all understand if someone's being brutally beaten or cheated on repeatedly. We all get that. But that doesn't mean that all of a sudden your kids' lives become better as a result. And I think one of the things that's interesting to me about this whole concept is I remember the Murphy Brown episode where Murphy Brown, this is where I remember this kind of like blowing up culturally, where Murphy Brown was going to have a child, right? Apart from not having a married, not having a husband, not having even a man that was going to be involved in the child's life. And Vice President Dan Quayle dared to suggest that, you know what, that's probably not a great idea. And it's not like Dan came up with this, right? Patrick Moynihan was talking about the crisis of this in the 1960s, Democrat senator from New York, and he was getting treated like he was some sort of like crazy bigot for suggesting that fatherless homes are a bad idea. But it was this idea that with that episode, I saw a major cultural shift start to take place where this idea that might have been housed in the university or in certain ideologies now was starting to become mainstream, that this was a manifestation of empowerment, that you don't need no man to raise a child. And as long as they have a one loving parent, that was sufficient. And I remember sitting here going, this is nuts.
Right.
Like it's one thing to say that, hey, a single mom doing her best in bad situations, maybe a single mom, not because of her choosing or desire, is someone that society should come along and help. But I'll never forget. I can't remember who it was that coined the phrase. She was talking about it. She goes, "It is perfectly appropriate for people wanting to help somebody in a difficult situation, but be very careful what you celebrate."
Right.
And that's where I felt like this transition, like that's where, when you talk about this idea of divorcing, having children and sex from marriage,
there it was.
That's where I started to see this cultural popularization of an idea that, well, why do we need a mother and a father? This is just some archaic traditional idea. And again, this was not a grassroots movement where we just saw thousands of single parents going, oh my gosh, this is so wonderful. It was quite the opposite. Right? We had this pushed on us
from Hollywood.
Yes. Like it was crazy. And Hollywood's all doing it. And again, part of it is they can get away with certain aspects of it, which is to say it's easier for them because they've got enough money to hire the au pairs and everything else. That doesn't mean it's stop looking at the Hollywood starlet telling you that this is so empowering for them. Go look at what's happening to their kids.
Right.
Like wealth doesn't overcome. It may overcome some of the difficulties for the parent. It is not overcoming the difficulties for the child.
Right. And when it becomes really obvious, Nick, is when it's one thing for a woman to take care of a baby by herself. It's another thing for a woman to take care of a 14-year-old boy by herself. Okay. And when the boy gets big enough that he can push her around, I mean, I've seen it. I've heard about it. And the mother's sitting there like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do?
Well, can I give you an example of this real quick? I was just speaking at a convention a while back, and this mother comes up to me, very nice lady, and she goes, my son's father left us, kind of like ruined my whole life at that one point. I'm remarried now, great man, but my young boy is just sometimes just totally unmanageable, like, throwing fits. Now he's only 6. And I kind of stopped her. I said, let me tell you something right now. They don't grow out of it. They get more violent and more capable of violence.
Correct.
Children are taught out of things. They don't grow out of phases. They are taught out of phases. And so we had this conversation about, okay, well, your husband now, does your son see him as dad? Yes. Do you let him discipline as dad? Well, I said, look, I'm going to tell you right now, I understand that every motherly instinct in you wants to prevent an abusive situation or whatnot. And obviously, if abuse takes place, that's something to consider. But if you're not going to let him discipline as dad, your 6-year-old is not going to grow out of this. He's going to become stronger and more violent and more ungovernable until one day somebody stops him, and it won't be you and it won't be your husband. It'll be the cops.
Right.
And they're
Right.
going to stop him by whatever means necessary. And then they're going to put him in a little cage.
Right.
But it's to your point, it's this idea that we've glamorized this notion that we can have a society with a bunch of young men running around, essentially being not having a father in the home or any sort of positive male role model, and get away with that because
Correct.
some sociology professor thinks it's a really neat, hip, vogue idea.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm really glad that you brought that up for a number of reasons. I mean, that scenario that you described is, we could do the whole hour just talking about that scenario. The one thing that I want to add to it, to what you've already said, is that it's a very common problem in step families.
Yeah.
Because mom and dad are on different wavelengths automatically all the time anyway, right?
Yeah.
And so the easiest, that's just a fact. And mom wants the child to feel good. Dad wants the child to behave. You need both of those in the family, okay? And it's just too easy for the woman to say, you don't really understand. He's not really your kid. You're hurting him. Stop. It's like,
Yeah.
I mean, I did that. I'm the dragon lady in the classroom, and I'm like, honey, you're hurting him.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? I mean, that it came out of my hormones, right? I mean, that's just, so we're expecting ourselves to be able to overcome all of these natural impulses that are built into the body. And it's not that easy, And so the conflict that you described there between the mother and the stepfather, it's extremely common. One time, just to go along with society endorsing this, I've heard Dr. Phil say that stepfathers shouldn't even bother. Wow. It's too hard, and it's not the same thing against Dr. Phil. I don't think he's the problem per se in this instance. He's just noticing how hard it is. We think we're going to overcome it, and you really can't. It's
well, what I think is amazing is that this buried in, it seems like rooted in this idea of separating sex from children and sex and having children from marriage is kind of, again, rooted in this popular idea that we're all just interchangeable pieces.
Right.
And that if we have some sort of, natural instinct as women or as men, then that's something to be overcome or disregarded as merely a traditional or a religious construct, when in reality, it's like, okay, well, wait a second. When we fight against these things, nobody seems to be happy with the results. When we recognize these things as complementary attributes to be used in conjunction with one another, not in competition with one another, all of a sudden things seem to align and marriages seem to be happier and kids seem to be more stable. And yet we're living amidst a population right now where, to your point, part two is no. You don't need a marriage to have kids. You don't need a mother and a father both in the relationship, and we're starting to see the results, but it doesn't stop there, right? Like there's more.
Yeah, I'm sorry to say there's more. Yeah. But before I go to the third ideology, I want to just say about the divorce ideology, because again, I call this the divorce ideology. It implicates single parents as well as divorce, but also the whole trend of third-party reproduction. We call it third-party reproduction, where you purchase sperm, you purchase egg, you purchase the services of a surrogate. All of that is a kind of separation of a child from one of their parents. Anything that separates the child from one of their parents by a conscious act, not because somebody died or somebody's mentally ill, an unavoidable tragedy. Okay, you understand that's going to happen, and you have to have some provision for that. But that's not what Murphy Brown was about.
Yeah.
And that's not what the sperm banks are about. That's about something willful, a decision on the part of one parent to exclude the other parent and to assert without proof that this is unimportant to the child. And the further point here is that the whole sexual revolution can be understood as a revolt against the body. We are at war with the human body because these are all impulses that are built into the body. The reproductive process is obviously a bodily process, right? It involves a male body and a female body, and we're in rebellion against all of the things that flow naturally from the body. And that's why it's so hurtful. I think that's why it goes to the core of who you are. When that thing gets disrupted,
Yeah.
it's extremely hurtful to people. It's not a micro deal. It's not a small thing. You can't easily override it, in my opinion. So that's what we're seeing. Okay, so now contraceptive ideology, divorce ideology. The third one I call the gender ideology. And I've been calling it that for a long time, so that a lot of people use that terminology now, but the gender ideology is basically saying what you just said a minute ago, that men and women are kind of interchangeable. We're like interchangeable parts, and that any differences that we see between men and women are certainly culturally constructed and can be overwritten if we want to. And this has turned into what we now call the gender ideology. Usually now when people use that term, they're referring to transgender issues and related issues. But before that, you had the whole push to normalize homosexual acts as though the sexual act between persons of the same sex is equivalent to the sexual act between persons of the opposite sex, as though we should be indifferent as a society between whether you have a same-sex or opposite-sex partner. And then before that, even, of course, there's feminism, the kind of radical feminism that involves seeing men and women as somehow interchangeable. All of those things, that whole pile of ideologies, has made marriage almost unintelligible to us, and made it much more challenging to do marriage and to do marriage well. So all three of these ideologies are interrelated with each other. And when I say the sexual revolution, that's what I'm talking about.
So step one, the contraceptive idea, again, separation of sex from children. Step two, or I don't know about step or phases, but like the second component is divorce ideology, the idea of divorcing both sex from marriage and having children from marriage. And then that third is the gender ideology, which is again kind of this on maybe more of the feminist bent. It's this concept of no real significant differences between man and woman. And then now on kind of the transgender is almost the logical outworking of this idea that this is all just a social construct, and however I want to identify is what gives me meaning and purpose, regardless of physical or biological reality. That's kind of like the logical outworking.
Correct.
So here's my question. So if we use that as the sexual revolution, those areas, who came up with this crap?
Well, it wasn't just one guy, it wasn't just one person. It's a confluence of things.
Yeah.
And I know you want to talk about Marx, and we will talk about Marx, but each one of these elements have their own proponents who emphasize one thing more than the other, but they kind of have come together, and so, like I mentioned already, the contraceptive ideology is largely promoted by population control people and eugenics people, the ruling class, Nick, for, I don't know, decades, but really my whole adult life, the global ruling class does not see the continuation of the human race as a priority. There are too many people out there, and the more
and you see this going all the way back to Malthus. And when we talk about Malthusian concepts, I mean, Malthus was actually saying that, well, no, what we need is a good pandemic. What we need is to put poor tenement housing next to malarial swamps. Like this is how bad this got with respect to this ideology. And it's not that, again, Malthus was an elite. He was not, it was not some just weird guy in somebody's basement.
Right. So there's that aspect of it, but the other things that I want to call attention to are the ways in which the left and the right have conspired on these things. Very seldom will you see the terms left and right coming out of the Ruth Institute. Very seldom, right? Because the issues that we care about and track the most, left and right really converge in a way, So let's take the the IVF baby idea. Okay, we now have the specter of a Republican government talking about subsidizing IVF. Okay, I saw this in the Wall Street Journal. Somebody in the Wall Street Journal is writing, "This is our solution to the population decline: subsidizing IVF." So there's a way that the left and the right converge here. The left hates the body. I mean, I'm going to overstate it, obviously, but the fact that we're male and female offends them because we can't ever be equal. We can't ever be truly equal as long as we go, that's a man and that's a woman. There are differences you can't overwrite. So it offends their sense of equality. But on the right, and your listeners may need to hear this more than the other, on the right, that male and female kind of bothers them too, because having a baby is something you can't really do by yourself. You cannot. Radical individualism doesn't cut it in the family. That was the first thing that really got me out of being a free market libertarian economist and into more of the study of the family, was the fact that, wait a second. Radical individualism does not work where the family is concerned. I need a man to have a baby. What do you mean I can't do it alone? Well, I'll purchase some sperm. You're still using him. You still need him, right? You still need the guy. And what we've done systematically is to take relationships that should be built on love and turn them into commercial transactions. And we think we're going to be okay with that. One time years ago, since you brought up the single mother, you brought up Murphy Bound. Years ago, I wrote this article called "There's No Such Thing as a Single Mother." It was called "The Mother of All Myths," I think is what I called it. Like 20 years ago or something. I wrote this article. And the idea was, look, the single mother seems like she's doing it all alone. But in fact, she has a daycare provider. She has an employer. Maybe she has the government giving her money. Maybe her parents are helping her. Okay. She's not really doing it alone, but instead of her husband providing money for her, her employer is providing money for her. Her husband loved her. Her husband cared about the child. The employer doesn't care. The employer doesn't care about you and your baby. It's just a commercial transactional thing. When you're no use to them, you're gone. Same way with daycare. Oh, think about that. I'm a single independent woman. Have you ever seen a single mother when her daycare provider can't show up? When she gets called 15 minutes before work that the babysitter can't come? She's a mess, right? Because she is really super dependent on that person. So again, it's a commercial transaction where there was the love and cooperation between mom and dad, and money getting changed, money getting passed around and stuff. But there was something there besides just the transaction, and that's what I think our friends on the right really have a harder time seeing that.
No, I think that's true, and I say this as someone that, like, Chicago school is not free market enough for me. Right, I'm an Austrian school guy, right? Like, I love Mises and Menger and Hayek, and that. But I always make this distinction between the marketplace of goods and services and that which is sacred, right? And I don't want to commodify that which is the sacred. And so when it comes to things like having the commodification of children is a real problem. And we had this debate in the Virginia House of Delegates where it was, well, of course somebody should be able to get a fee for, aligning a surrogate mother up with two people that want a child. And it's like, we're going to let the free market. And it was funny because it was someone on the left. So we'll let the free market decide. I'm like, we finally found an area you want the free market to decide. And it's basically adjacent to human trafficking. Right. And so, it's amazing how, like, for me, these two things were never in conflict. Of course, I believe in free markets, but of course, there's also elements. I don't treat my home like a free market. Right? Like, it can't be. It doesn't function effectively like a free market. But to your point, it is amazing to me how. Because you're right. I've seen both sides of the political spectrum. I shouldn't say both. I've seen a variety of sides of the political spectrum, whether it's the quest for kind of hyper egalitarianism, right? Like we all have to be equal with equal outcomes and equal everything, or something is wrong or unjust.
Right.
Or on the other side, it's like we all have to be free to make whatever individual decisions make us happy. And I always look at I've spoken to libertarian groups before where I've said, look, I greatly admire this idea of skepticism, the concentration of power in the hands of government, or using the government to try to impose particular worldviews that is kind of outside the capacity or scope of a government entity. I said, but the moment we separate liberty from personal responsibility, you don't have liberty, you have licentiousness. And I feel like that's where we've gone with some of these concepts. Is we've moved in this licentious idea that I have some sort of inherent right to pursue whatever gives me, Maslow's self-actualization, and anything that stands in my way is either a violation of my liberty or a violation of my identity. And I'm like, whoa, step back for a second. This is what happens when you deny the existence of any sort of objective truth or morality in order to just pursue your own individual gains. But when you talk about this, something that's been kind of a top-driven component, right? So with the contraception, it was the idea, or the separating sex from babies, it was this idea that a lot of your elites kind of looked at it as, well, those are the unwashed masses, right? Or those are the people that cause crime, or those are the people. So my goodness, why would we want to? And you saw this with Paul Ehrlich too, with the population bomb and the idea that we were all hundreds of millions of people were going to die as a result of famine if we continue to have kids. And so it was the idea, well, if we still want to have sex, but kids are the problem, right? Because poor people are having them and it's going to drain up all of our resources. Well, then if you adopt that as your worldview, if you believe that is true, then you can understand how someone would come to the conclusion that we need to separate this idea that we're not going to stop people from having sex, but maybe we can stop them from having kids.
Correct.
And it's not a very, it's a pretty quick, it's a pretty straight line from, well, not all of us can stop having kids. And then Margaret Sanger now gets to decide through Planned Parenthood who should have kids and who should not have kids.
Well, the thing is that as soon as you give yourself permission to say there are too many people in the world, that's the beginning of the slippery slope right there. By what criteria? Like
I noticed they never mean themselves.
Who's in charge of this? Wait a minute. Who died and put you in charge? This is no good. And
so that's how the elites push the contraception point.
And let's be clear too that there's the population control aspect to it, but also the idea, well, it's just fun to have sex without worrying about babies, and this is the other thing. When I spoke to the young people at Live Action, this is a point that I really hope that they got, and I'm pretty sure that they did, that all three of these things are basically telling you, here's the big picture of the sexual revolution. And it's more like the serpent in the garden. Did God really tell you that? It's kind of like, the big message is you can do anything you want sexually and nothing bad will happen.
You're right.
To anybody around you, your kids will be fine. Don't worry.
That is a seductive proposition.
Exactly.
Because we have this inherent impulse. And as I always tell people, look, have kids. They're fun to make, right? If you're trying to convince somebody that any sexual impulse they have is A, natural, and B, therefore good, and therefore C, anything that stands in the way or prevents or inhibits is artificial and bad and standing in the way of you having a full experience. Well, then, oh my gosh. I mean, that opens that's a pretty seductive idea. Exactly. The problem is, right?
It's not true.
It's not true.
It's not true. Not a single one of these things are true. That's the point. And that's where the whole ideological part comes into it. But before we leave this point, You're right. It is seductive. It is intrinsically seductive because everybody wants to believe it. And this is what we have to be honest with ourselves as adult, mature people. Ask yourself, do you believe this because you want it to be true? Or do you really have other independent reasons for believing
Yeah.
this thing? And I also think it helps us understand, Nick, why it has swept through society so thoroughly. Because if you don't consciously, specifically resist, you will be swept away.
Yeah.
And this has happened to one religious body after another. It's happened to whole universities and schools. It's happened to all kinds of institutions. The path of least resistance is to say, sure, why not?
Well, and I think it's interesting too that you say that, because one of the ways it's swept through, because you're right, if you get a religious institution to go along with it and you remove a moral barrier, then you're
Right.
also removing a social barrier, social constriction.
Yeah.
And then what I think is fascinating now, and what I think parents are starting to realize, but still they are still blind to it, is that one of the ways that they have gotten people to adopt this so thoroughly within society is they have started exposing children to it at younger and younger ages, to where they are. And it's funny because the Bible warns about waking up this idea or this concept before someone is mature enough for it. And yet that's exactly what they're doing. They're exposing kids to all of these questions about sex and sexuality and sexual expression and sexual pleasure. And they are piquing curiosity. We're just educating them. Bull crap. You know what you are doing. You are piquing curiosity in a 5-year-old. Right? This is not just about explaining why Jimmy has 2 mommies. You are piquing curiosity and sexual questions in a 5-year-old, because the earlier you expose them to this vast array of new sexual concepts, the easier it is to normalize that within them and to convince them that if there are any consequences, well, that's a result of social conventions. That's a result of shaming, and shaming's bad. We need to be tolerant. Oh, and by the way, if there's economic or practical consequences beyond the purely moral, well, that's where the government comes in. And that's what I want to ask you about this second part, because it seems so counterintuitive. Right? Why, when you tell me the elites want to control the population and they want to make sure that only people like them are having their one designer child, that makes sense to me, right? That makes sense. I think it's evil. I think it's wrong, but it makes sense why they would come back. Why would anybody come to the conclusion, right? Why would anybody come to the conclusion that divorcing, having children within marriage is something that we need? Well, that's an archaic, old-fashioned sort of viewpoint, because it seems like, well, wait a second. If you don't have a mom and dad taking care of the kids, someone, like you said, there's no single mom, somebody's taking care of them. You're going to be dependent on somebody. Why would the elites push this idea of single motherhood or single fatherhood or whatever else it is, when you would think the elites would have recognized that, well, if you think population is a problem, well, population growing up in broken homes is a real problem. So why would they push that idea?
So that that does take us over into another area that looks more like Marxism, which I know you want to talk about, which is that when they started the welfare state, all of a sudden they had a population problem, because because you're paying people, the care of your family is not solely your responsibility. You're asking the family to outsource some of its functions,
Yeah.
And this is when they feel, well, there are too many of these poor people now. What just happened? We're giving away more money, and now there are more people lining up for the money. What are we going to do? Well, now, so this was part of what happened in the 1960s in the so-called Great Society. It's almost comical to read it. Oh my gosh, look, they keep having more kids. Why is that?
We've incentivized out of wedlock birth, and yet they keep having kids.
How did that even happen? Yeah. And so there was a moment there where there were some Marxists who believed that getting more people on welfare was a good thing. And the reason they believed it was a good thing is because in their mind, having lots of people on welfare would collapse the corrupt capitalist system. And so these are people who literally went around, not only were they in the background changing the law, but they were also trying to break down the work ethic that had always been part of American culture, right?
Yeah.
Especially among the poor and the working class. It says, okay, I don't have anything, but by golly, I'm going out to work every day and supporting my family. They literally tried to break that down.
So that was a manifestation of, and again, when we talk about Marxism, because a lot of people are like, oh, everything's Marxist, everything's a Red Scare. No, go read what Karl Marx had to say about the family. He believed that breaking down the traditional family was an inherent component of creating an ideal communist society, is that children had to be both procreated, educated, and raised collectively, and that the traditional family was just a bourgeois capitalist, conspiracy to oppress women.
Correct. I honestly don't believe Marx cared that much about women. Just like I don't believe
he certainly didn't care about his maid or his wife.
And he didn't care that much about the poor. When you get right down to it, that wasn't, honestly, that wasn't really what it was about for him. But yeah, Engels wrote this book, and I have it on my shelf. I was looking around for it. It's in the other room. He wrote this book about the family, the origins of family and private property. I think something like that is what it's called. And he draws this analogy between the husband and the wife. The wife's the proletariat, the husband's the bourgeois. And back in the beautiful days when everything was communist, there wasn't marriage back then, and children were just somehow children appeared, somehow children grew up.
The village raised them, just like Hillary said.
Somehow this all happened, and so for them, breaking down the family was every bit as big a priority as breaking down the capitalist system, because they, I think in their case, they saw the inequality. They saw that it was unequal and that it could never really be made equal. And if you look at what those modern versions of feminism always tried to do, they were trying to equalize men and women basically by neutralizing the impact of children, right? So if women, that's why in their mind, and they're not completely wrong, you can see there's a certain logic to it. As long as there are babies, there will be inequality between men and women. That can't be helped. And so their way of dealing with that was to say, well, we'll just abort the children away. Unless the mother really wants this, boom, no kids. It sounds crazy, but some of them, like Shulamith Firestone, for example, one of the more radical feminists, who is actually mentally ill, it turns out. She was already, like in the 60s, talking about artificial wombs, so that women wouldn't have to carry the child and all of that kind of thing. So it's rooted. The whole thing is rooted in this desire for equality that is a distortion.
Well, I think it's interesting when you actually elevate equality as a moral good in and of itself, you run into real problems. And I always do this exercise with students when I'm talking on a college campus. I'll say, how many of you support equality? And all of them will raise their hands. I said, okay, great. So if you had a room full of, good, honest, hardworking people, or no, I'm sorry. How many of you support equality? They all raise their hands. I say, okay, great. So we should treat the person who feeds the poor the same way we treat the person who eats the poor, right? Because that would be equal. Well, no, of course not. So context is necessary in order to discuss the concept of equality. Otherwise, equality becomes injustice, right? It has no moral connotation outside of a larger context. And yet, when you look at Marxism, egalitarianism is held up as the ultimate virtue of we're all equal, and that's good. Whoa, no, that's not good. Should we be equal before the law? Absolutely. Absolutely. Do we all have some sort of equal value as being created in the image of God? Yes, even though the Marxists don't believe in God, right? But this idea that and to your point, because women are the only ones that can get pregnant, no matter what California says, right? There's obviously a restraining component on a woman that is not shared equally by a man, which is in part why we make legal codes, which says, hey, man, we've always had religious, social, and legal codes that says, hey, man, if you get her pregnant, you bear responsibility.
Right.
You don't get
Right.
to just physically, you might get to run off, but we're not going to permit you to do so because we find something, because you have an inherent responsibility in what just happened. And now it's almost like, well, the response has been, and I always say a lot of feminist objectives seem like they were written by really, really caddish men, right? Like, hey, you know what? Women are upset because men are going out and they're getting women pregnant and they're abandoning them. And so the women go to the men and they say, hey, you can't abandon the women you get pregnant. And men say, what if we let you abort them?
Yeah, right.
Like,
Right,
what if
right.
that's the compromise? Kill the kid?
Right.
But so,
Yeah,
and on one side, you have this subversive Marxist approach, right? You have the Marxist that says, I want to undo the capitalist system because I want to replace it with a Marxist utopia. And so I'm going to actively encourage people to make what might be considered a bad decision within the current system so that we can bring about a new one, right? That's one
right.
strategy. Is there another strategy involved with this concept that is maybe not as subversive, but maybe naive?
Well, I want to answer your question this way. Okay. I want to take a step back from Marxism just for a moment, because if you noticed when I gave my speech, I didn't say this is a Marxist system. What I
Yeah.
said was the sexual revolution is a totalitarian ideology. Okay. And when I say totalitarian, what I mean is it intends to cover all of society. It intends to get into your head. It intends to remake the world into something that cannot be and that can only appear to be by continually propping it up. So it's not true that sex makes babies. That's a fact. If you're going to build a society on some other basis, you're going to have to be propagandizing all the time. You're going to have to be changing the incentives all the time. Kids really need their parents. You're going to have to do a lot of work to talk people out of that. And we're doing that work, right? I mean, so the thing to see is that the ideology, whether it's a Marxist ideology, whether it's a sexual revolutionary ideology, the point of an ideology, in my opinion, the point of the ideology, it is a cover story for a power grab.
Okay.
That's what you have to see. It's a cover story. The kids all sitting there saying, yes, we love equality, equality, equality. That is the cover story. Okay. And the way it works, you can never have full equality, which you pointed out to them brilliantly. And any of them could have figured it out if they could think past the propaganda. You could see it for yourself that the term equality can never be fully achieved. Without context, it's not even meaningful, right? But if you keep saying equality, 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 and people will say, yeah, that's what we want. What you're doing is you're writing a blank check to the people in power to do whatever is necessary to bring about this impossible end. Now, in the sexual revolution, we're basically giving a blank check to people to say, yeah, I want to be able to do anything I want sexually and have nothing bad happen to me. Rescue me from this problem that I've created for myself. Rescue me from that problem I've created for myself. Subsidize IVF because I waited till I was 40 to get started with my family. Rescue me. That's I think that's the process. You propose something that's impossible but appealing, and you don't let people look too closely, right? You keep the noise level up so people don't look at it too closely. And then you just keep doing what you want and infiltrating into more and more parts of society. I also want to go back to what you said about the kids in the school. Okay. Today, most people are aware, if they have kids or they have any kids in their life, they're aware something is really off with what's being taught in the schools. But the fact is, sex ed in the schools has been going on for a long time. They just keep ratcheting up the intensity and the perversity, really, of what they're teaching. And it's always had this kind of, how would we call it, the appealing idea. We're just trying to educate the children about the facts of life because maybe their parents won't. Well, okay, maybe some parents won't, but in point of fact, this is a sacred place. And by taking the conversation about sex and its meaning out of the home and putting it into a public place filled with strangers, filled with a bunch of children and an adult authority figure who's not related to any of them, that act by itself, even if you were teaching 100% true things, that act, that context is problematic all by itself. It's conveying a message all by itself that is an untrue message. And so that's why in my book here that you so nicely talked about, The Sexual State, the last chapter is called Manifesto for the Family. Yeah. And the very first item on the manifesto is abolish sex ed in the schools, all of it.
It's amazing because people, you brought up an incredibly important point there. And it's this idea that you're offering some picture of an ideal or some sort of seductive reality that people wish could exist. And now you have experts or you have people in authority telling you it's possible if only they had more power, if only you were willing to give up more freedom or give up responsibility, and they'll take it over for you because they're the experts. And then when it doesn't happen or doesn't materialize, it's always because they didn't have enough power, or it's because somebody evil is thwarting them. They don't want us to have this wonderful utopia that you have empowered me to provide. And so they keep standing in the way and obstructing it. And the first thing starts is we got to get power out of those people's hands. And then when the power is out of their hands, somehow they keep obstructing it, right? They become counter-revolutionaries. And now we've got to go after those people. And it's not good enough to just take power away. We've got to re-educate them or put them in jail because their mere presence is... No, reality is standing in the way of what you're trying to achieve. And you've got to continually find more enemies to blame for your failure. And so that explains to me kind of why elites would push the idea of separating children from marriage, right? If you do have a Marxist worldview, well, then that's part of your goal is you believe children should be raised collectively. And so if they're in government approved daycare, if they're in government approved primary school, if they're in government approved high school, if they're in a government subsidized university, well, yes, they're being educated the way that people with that worldview think they should be educated and think they should be raised. Now, the third component that we talked about, the gender ideology, and why would so we've kind of explained why would an elite push the contraceptive component? Why would they push the divorce component? Then we get into the gender, and this is the one that, in my opinion, felt like it happened the fastest. And that's probably because you've already laid the groundwork with the other two phases that you've talked about. But what do you see? And maybe this goes into your explanation about the totalitarian nature of this. What do you see as why would the elites push? And by the way, when we say elites, I don't want to make that some shadowy figure. I think what both of us mean when we talk about this is that there are powerful, influential people in society, usually along the categories of politics, arts and entertainment, academia, media and journalism. These are people that generally have influence in the way that culture or peoples look at particular issues. And there's no question that when you look at elite figures within those culturally shaping institutions, they have pushed certain ideologies. And the one with respect to gender in general, or this idea that gender is nothing more than a social construct that you can rewrite in your own mind, and now everyone needs to reinforce your view of your identity, or they're a bigot, or they're mean. Nobody's going to convince me that was a grassroots effort, right? That was, or a grassroots phenomenon. That was definitely pushed by elements within academia, arts and entertainment, politics. But why? Why do you think they would do that?
Okay, I have an answer to that question, but I want to go back to something else you said before I forget it. Okay, because you made an incredibly important point, and I want to put a label on it. You were referring to the need of every ideology to have a scapegoat class. Every ideology you can think of has had its scapegoats. Okay, so because no matter how much power they get, they can't do the impossible. It takes power to do the impossible. That's part of the appeal. But no matter how much power they have, they can't do it. Therefore, they have to have someone to blame. In modern America, it's Christians. It's traditional Christians. We're the scapegoats right now. Okay, that's fine. That's been our job throughout history. A lot of times, that's our job. But the Soviets had their kulaks. The Nazis had their Jews. every ideology will generate a scapegoat class. The COVID ideologues, okay, now COVID had nothing to do with Marxism because there's no class analysis or anything like that, right? But
Yeah.
it was an impossible goal. We're going to get rid of all the cases.
Yeah.
You know, and their scapegoat class was the unvaccinated.
Vaccinated.
The unvaccinated was the scapegoat class. So I think that's a very important element. And I, your instinct was 100% right. And I wanted to be sure to put that name on it because it's easier to see,
Yeah.
with the label. But anyway, back to the gender ideology. And you want to know, you said this came on us so fast. And I said,
well, I think it got popularized so fast. I know it's been in academia for a long time, but
feminism that's the real question, is how did the thing we in modern times call feminism, how did that take root? How did that take root so deeply, so quickly, with so little resistance? The modern feminist ideologue will say, oh, well, we're still ruled by the patriarchy. But the fact is, feminism has been an extremely effective ideology in America.
mm-hmm.
They've remade many, many aspects of society in their image and likeness. And they just have. So how did that happen? Why did that happen? Who is behind that? And I have partial answers, because the whole idea that there's an elite class doing stuff, it makes it sound like you're doing conspiracy theory or something like that. But there are certain things that you can easily see. So, for example, one of the most prominent feminists, early feminists of our era that we're talking about, was Kate Millett. Okay, and Kate Millett, wrote an important book. Her concept of feminism got put into women's studies departments all across America.
Mm-hmm.
She was on the cover of Time magazine. She somehow, her set of ideas took root. It couldn't possibly have been that women made that happen. There had to have been some men who said, hey, we're going to put her on Time magazine. Hey, these are the ideas we're going to have in our university all across America. How did that happen? And it turns out Kate Millett's sister, Mallory, is now a devout Roman Catholic, and she reports that her sister was mentally ill. Her sister was literally certifiably mentally ill, as in schizo, but people defended her, protected her, promoted her, and so on and so forth. So I did a long interview with her because I really wanted to get her reminiscences on the record, of what her sister was really like, and so on and so forth. And I asked her this, who put her on the cover of Time magazine? and she didn't know, she didn't know how that happened. But I do know one thing though, Nick, and that is that John D. Rockefeller III, we haven't mentioned his name yet, but John D. Rockefeller III would meet anybody's criteria of a member of the elite, right? Not only is he wealthy, but he's part of a wealthy dynasty, right? He's the third. And he was the guy who really started saying, hey, population is a big problem. He founded the population, what did he call it? The Population Council, I think it was called. He was the one who, really in the 50s and 60s, really was trying to convince people, too many people in the world. He was behind people being convinced, gosh, if we don't control population in these poor countries, they'll all become communists. So that's how contraception and population programs became part of U.S. foreign policy. Okay. Rockefeller's in the background of that. But it never really took root, Nick. It never, because people thought he was creepy. People thought it was creepy to say, you're having too many kids. This is like none of your business, buddy. Get lost. But at some point, he figured out that if he started talking about women's empowerment and women's education, he could get most of what he was trying to get without sounding like a creep. So in 1974, at the Population Council meeting in Bucharest that year, he gave this speech, this very famous speech about women's empowerment. All of a sudden, this is the new definition of feminism. I have it in my book, The Sexual State. It's in there. In the chapter on contraception and propaganda for contraception. But after that, then it became a defining quality of feminism that you had to be in favor of abortion and contraception. That became, no other kinds of feminism were on the table after that.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, it became much more, his path was smoothed compared to what it had been before, when he was just saying too many people,
Yeah.
oh, if the women don't get married until they're 30, you're going to have a lower population. You're going to have smaller population growth, and he would, objectively, he was correct in that assessment of how people would respond to that message and stuff. And talk about an appealing message. Talk about a seductive message. When you really think about what modern feminism says to women, it says to us, you go girl. If you have problems in your life, it's somebody else's fault. It's the fault of the patriarchy. And it kind of opens the door for behavior that is appealing. So it's superficially appealing, but when you get right down to it, the people who really fully embrace that way of thinking about the relation between men and women, they're not going to have a happy life. They're not going to have a happy marriage.
Well, they're going
to cause a lot of problems. And
we're finding out how many ulterior motives there actually were. Like, I think it's fascinating when I will have somebody, when I'm kind of debating someone on the concept of feminism, and they want to caricature it as nothing more than wanting equality before the law and access to opportunity, I'll be like, I absolutely believe that there are some people that for them, that is what feminism means. But if you think that's what the feminist movement is isolated to, I don't think you've read some of the most prominent. Here's what I've noticed about the feminist movement. They didn't elevate people that said, we just want the vote and equal access to opportunity. They didn't elevate. They elevated Simone de Beauvoir, who believed that women should not be allowed to choose to stay home and be mothers in the household, because if they did, too many of them would choose it and it would disrupt the movement of the revolution.
Right.
Exactly. So it's like, please don't tell me that like my eyes and ears are lying to me when I'm reading what some of the most respected and regardless of what your individual views of feminism are, you didn't write the textbooks. They did.
Right. Right.
Steinem did. And they're the ones that were pushed by culture, or pushed by whoever in order to be the defining. And I saw this thing come out. There's a magazine called EVIE magazine. And I saw this thing that they just put up that was great. They said, they told us motherhood could wait and then sold it back to us at $12,000 a round.
Right.
And I was like, whoa. And it says inside the $1 billion industry that profits from women's bodies. And that's why when you talk about Rockefeller saying, look, he had one objective. And when he tried to explain the nature of his objective, people thought it was creepy and weird and didn't want it. So he changed it to something they did want and got what he wanted anyways. You're seeing the same thing when it comes to this idea of telling women, like, you can wait to have kids into your late 30s and 40s, right? And if it turns out that if by having kids in your late 30s and 40s, you find out that they've got trisomy 18, or you find out that they might have a birth defect, well, that's fine. Abort them and just have another one. And then if you wait so long to where you're having infertility issues, that's great. That's what IVF is for, right? Then and now we're going to custom your baby, because now we can do genetic alterations to make, do you want a girl? Do you want a boy? Do you want to prevent against certain things? And I'm looking at this going, this is all, I mean, forget just for a moment, forget the morality of, I want to customize my baby to get the one I want. Look at the perverse motives with respect to making money off of doing that. And that kind of leads us into that third category too of the gender idea, the massive amount of money that is being spent right now on chemical castration of minors, of gender transition surgeries, which they don't transition you into it. It's like it's false advertising on its front. You cannot transition from man to woman. You cannot transition from woman to man. The best you can get is some sort of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde surgery that's incredibly expensive, that won't actually give you the thing that they're telling you get, but will give you a lifetime of medications and surgical procedures and everything else in order to try to sustain it. Like, I mean, it's incredible to me. But so when we ask, like, what was we've kind of explained the motivation on the first one. We've explained the motivation on the second one. The motivation on the third one, I mean, there's clearly a profit motive, right? And I don't think profit's a bad thing unless you're profiting from something that's evil or degenerate or destructive. Yeah.
Which in this case you are.
Yeah, which in this case you are, right? But is there any other motivation we can point to other than the profit motive for trying to push this idea that, oh, well, of course you can just arbitrarily change your identity?
Wait a minute. Nick. You've got 3 good reasons. How many more good reasons do you need? I mean, come on. We're over determining our problem here. We have.
Well, but can I tell you? But again, I here's what I'll say. Like, the reason why I think there's separation here, it is because, like you said, like I can talk to somebody that wants contraception because they think it's part of the feminist empowerment. And then I can talk to somebody else that for them, the primary motivation is the idea that the planet's overcrowded and, climate change is killing us, all of it because of anthropogenic climate change. And so we got to reduce the population. And then I can talk to somebody else that looks at it primarily from the perspective of there's so many kids dying of poverty in third world countries that this is what's necessary. So I can look at these various motivations, which all lead to a similar end state. When it comes to specifically like the transgender issue that we're facing right now, I see the obvious profit motive with the pharmaceutical industry, with the medical industry. But there's another motivation in there. We talked about this on when we talked about the divorce idea, that there was a Marxist motivation to say the more people that we get on the welfare state, the more people that we get dependent upon the government for their healthcare, for their sustenance, for their education, the closer we get toward the Marxist utopia we want, right? And so I understand that. I don't agree with it, but I understand the motivation. When it comes to this, I feel like the revolt against reality, the rebellion against reality is somewhat deeper than those other two. Does that make sense?
It is. You're correct. You're correct that the revolt against reality is very deep, but the resentment of reality is also very deep. And so what transgenderism offers people is the ultimate concept of being the self-made man. Okay. And you have to admit, as Americans, we love the self-made man, right? Yeah. And usually we mean it metaphorically, yeah. Right? But what people are doing is they've got this concept that, maybe is the idea that you are responsible for creating your destiny and you're responsible for creating your character and overcoming obstacles and so on. There's something very good and noble about that. But even the best and most noble thing that people can do, we could, because of original sin, we are capable of corrupting it, running it into the ground if we have no limits on it. And this is what we do. I mean, typically, every heresy you can think of in the Christian church has this form. There's something that's true, and they just run it right into the ground without any limits, without any context, And that, I think the reason gender ideology is remotely plausible to people is because it appeals to this kind of radical individualism that is consumerist in nature. I can buy it. And, you have to admit, Madison Avenue spent lots and lots of money convincing people that you can have what you want and that we'll deliver it to you. If you just give us some money, we'll give you what you want, And so we're used to that. And it's not an easy thing for Americans to look at in themselves, to say, this is something we thought was good. We thought this was a strength in our national character. And it is, but only up to a point.
Well, it's the idea of the perversion of it's the perversion of the good. Like there's an impulse, and there's a positive manifestation, and there's a negative manifestation.
Correct.
But if you treat it as if it's, well, any manifestation should be looked at equally or has equal value, well, then I guess we shouldn't be surprised. And
the same is true with equality, because you explained that very well. It's not possible for people to be equal in every single dimension. That's not possible because we're uniquely individual and everything like that. But when somebody says we're going to give you equality, you need to sit up, your antenna need to go up. And you need to go, what exactly do you mean when you say equality?
Yeah.
What exactly are you talking? When you say women's empowerment, what exactly do you
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
Because the fuzziness of the concepts allows a lot of slippage and a lot of mischief is done. A lot of mischief is done with concepts that are um, that are that are used in an ambiguous way.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh,
And so
I get this all the. I
just
love getting asked I love getting asked the question. Do you support a woman's right to choose? I always love it. Choose what? Well,
right,
choose their own healthcare. Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh,
right,
so you support. Oh, so you support abortion? Ah, now we're actually at the question that you really wanted me to answer. Now we've erased the ambiguity that you tried to use to sell everyone in the room on the concept,
right,
and now we're actually talking about we want. Okay, so now I want you to tell me what's abortion.
right.
And then we get into defining our terms. Oh, what you want to know is, do I support anyone's right to systematically destroy innocent human life? No, that I don't. Whether it's a
No,
woman, whether it's a man, whether it's a boy, a girl, nope, don't support that. But you're right. They sell it on the ambiguity of something that you already kind of are inclined to agree with, and then they get you on the specifics,
right.
and they
Oh, God.
associate the two.
So,
Let me. Sorry, go ahead.
no, I can't let this go by because on the issue that has to do with transgenderism, this is where an enormous amount of damage has been done with ambiguity of the term. In a column I wrote for the National Catholic Register, I don't know, about a year ago, I listed all the different ways that the term transgender is sometimes used. There were 9 different ways. Okay.
Huh.
So you got one word that means 9 different things.
Yeah.
There's going to be confusion. So here's the way it works. When somebody says, "Oh, aren't you in favor of transgenderism?" They want you to think of the confused teenage child who needs this or they're going to commit suicide. They don't want you to think of the man who opportunistically adopts the label transgender so that he can compete in women's sports and win, or so that he can be in a woman's prison and have access to his preferred victim. They don't want you to think of that. And when you say, oh, you think all transgender people are predators. No, that is not what I think.
Yeah.
Right? But the fact that they use one word to cover all these things, that is a very common trick in the sexual revolution. I just want to say that.
Oh yeah.
Feminism is the same thing. The word feminism. Usually I don't use that word because of that very problem that you called attention to, right? So look at people, avoid these ideological words. They're spring loaded from the beginning to go off in your face.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's when Jordan Peterson puts such emphasis on be specific. Like, what are you actually talking about? Yeah. And I've noticed that in politics that doesn't pay, right? What pays is to speak in ambiguities, because it gives you a wide field to be able to operate and then retreat. And so it's the same thing when I get into discussions about toxic masculinity. Well, what do you mean by that? And when we get into the specifics, then we can have a discussion, but I'm not going to discuss the ambiguity with you because I know you're using that as a linguistic trap. Well, let me ask, I want to kind of close out with this. I want to close out with this because I could be here for a lot longer. So one of I want to go back to what I said at the very beginning, because you said something in your talk. And it's something we've discussed on this show, and it's the idea of the issue is never the issue is the revolution. And so when we talk about the sexual revolution, and some people might come to the conclusion, well, gosh, if it was about contraception, or if it was about this, or if it was about that, at what point do you have your victory day, do your little march, ticker tape parade, and say, okay, we won? And the answer is never.
Correct.
Never. Exactly. They can't win. The moment they win, they're done. Right. So here's my question. I don't think anybody in my generation, when I was growing up, nobody could have convinced me when I was 20, 25, 30. Nobody could have convinced me that within 10 years, I was going to be living in a world where if you didn't openly celebrate drag queen story hour, you were a bigot according to roughly half the population of the country. Nobody could have convinced me that we were going to. I would have said, look, as much as I'm aware of politics and culture, that's hyperbolic language. You're probably, but then I read articles going back to the 1970s with some of the most prominent French existentialists, feminists, postmodernists. And I start to then read about, well, of course, minors should be free to express their sexuality. And I'm looking at this going, what? And then you read the names. You read the names of these various articles, and it's Michael Foucault. It's Jean-Paul Sartre. It's Simone de Beauvoir. These are not randos speaking in somebody's basement somewhere. These are the very people that feature prominently across any course that you would take in an American university in psychiatry, psychology, sociology, anthropology, women's studies. And so my question to you is, if we thought the sexual revolution was going to end somewhere, and we know that it's not, what do you think is the next step? And is there anything we can do to fight it?
Well, okay. Whoa, I wasn't ready for that. You said so much there, Nick. I gotta pull myself together. Yeah, I'm still back on Michel Foucault and these people that are really unintelligible in a way. I mean, it's very hard to read them because they're so bad. But okay. So of the three ideologies that I've talked about, I can tell you what they think their endpoint is.
Okay.
But before I do that, the reason the issue is never the issue, the reason the issue is always the revolution, is because a revolution is always about power. And the people who are running things, and who are running this con job, if you just think of it as a con job, you won't be far wrong, right? They're insatiable. They're insatiable. They're not going to stop, and what they're doing, we know as Christians that what they're doing is not going to make them happy in the end. It's not going to satisfy them. They're never going to be satisfied, right? Because they're looking in the wrong place. So that's the answer to that part of the question. Now, as to the three ideologies, there's no question in my mind that the end game of the contraceptive ideology is full-on population control. There's no question in my mind that that's what they want. They've been saying it for years that that's what they want.
They're not hiding the ball.
They're not hiding the ball. They've never, they kind of hid it for a while there, but no, they, and I think, well, I'm gonna leave that right there. I'll let you get somebody else on here to talk about COVID in this regard. Okay.
Yeah.
Because I don't, there are a lot of people who know more about that than I do, but just suffice to say, it doesn't surprise me what they did. Okay. The divorce ideology, the end game there, and this you can find from reading law review articles and things like that, like the kind of radical family law people, their end game is complete separation of biology from the definition of parenthood. Their goal is contract parenthood, so that any combination of adults can make a contract over any child, and that all those contracts would be legally enforceable. So for a child to have three parents, this is what they loved about gay marriage, okay? Because gay marriage was the concept that two men should be treated the same as a man and a woman for purposes of law and for purposes of marriage. What it means is that the only thing it can mean is that biology will not determine parenthood. That will not be the sole or perhaps even the primary definition of parenthood. The state will decide who counts as a parent. For whatever reasons they have, the state will decide. It won't be that the state is observing a natural reality and writing it down, which is what
that's an important distinction.
Yeah. You could, if you were thinking, you could see that at once. In 2008, in Prop 8, I saw at once that this is what it was going to mean. And I could never get the libertarians to pay attention. And it just drove me crazy that they could not see how big a step that is to say the state's going to decide who counts as the parent, so that's where they want to go. And the gender ideology people, they want transhumanism. Nick, they're headed to transhumanism, and they're headed to the complete removal of sex, the sex of the body, male and female, the complete removal of male and female from law and social life, from law and society. They don't want male and female. They don't want husband and wife. They don't want mother and father. They want partner. They want parent. They want everything gender neutral. And the end of that line is going to be transhumanism. Yeah, I don't have any doubt about that anymore.
Yeah. Do you think, wow, do you think, kind of going back to some of those articles I mentioned, going all the way back to the 70s with some of these prominent thinkers in existentialism, deconstructionism, because Derrida was another one, postmodernism. Do you think I feel like the next page in this is they're going to stop making distinctions with respect to age. And I think they've already, what's that?
They're going to normalize pedophilia?
Yeah.
Is that what
yeah.
No question about that. No question about that. I don't know that it's next, but in my opinion, pedophilia has been baked into the sexual revolution from the very beginning. Okay, and here's what I mean. I mean something very specific by that. When you have thinkers like Alfred Kinsey, Wilhelm Reich,
John Money.
Well, no, I'm not worried about John Money so much right now. Okay. Wilhelm Reich is the guy I'm thinking about. He's the guy who actually wrote a book called The Sexual Revolution. He was your first Freudian Marxist combo guy, okay, like in the 30s. And his position was that children, that for healthy development, children need to be sexual. And they need the right to be sexual. And I think he thought, and I think Kinsey thought, that what they need is to be sexual with each other. They weren't so much saying adults are fine,
Yeah.
But children, it's part of because Kinsey felt he had been sexually repressed. Reich felt he had been sexually repressed, and this is bad for him. So get rid of your Presbyterian father, telling you not to do it, right? What children need is the opportunity to express themselves sexually. They're sexual from birth. This was a Kinsey thing.
Yeah.
People are sexual from birth, right? And so what children really need is the opportunity to explore their sexuality without adult interference and so on and so forth. Well, so obviously pedophiles are going to be attracted to this point of view, right?
Yeah.
But also, if you think about the divorce ideology, which I was telling you about, right, and that we stumbled over a little bit, but I want you to just think through the further implication of the divorce ideology was also to redefine childhood. And what I mean by that is that when you say kids don't really need their mom and dad, it really doesn't matter if mom has a sequence of husbands rather than your mom being married to one guy. What you're really saying is something about childhood, that a child doesn't need a stable home with a mom and a dad to assist them to mature development. Kids don't really need that. And then along comes Kinsey and Reich to say what they really need is the opportunity to be sexual, and so that stuff, that mix is already there, and we know now that there are people in our world who have this as their sexual taste, and that some of those people have a lot of power and a lot of money, and it's well,
I don't. This is another thing too, where Kinsey was being pushed by like Time magazine and everyone else, and then people started to finally look at some of the things that Kinsey was doing, and when you look at some of the tables that mention the ages, and I'm trying to say this in a way that doesn't get us, like censored on YouTube.
When you Table 31 where some so-called researcher presented data that he supposedly had collected from Kinsey that had to do with orgasm and the age of the person having the orgasm and how long it took them to achieve it. And, whoever collected this so-called data should have been in jail.
Well, and to give people an idea, because right now people are probably thinking 11, 12, 13, that would be bad enough. Try 6 months. Right. That is what this respected researcher who was ushered in as one of the grandfathers of the sexual revolution thought was ethical research in order to prove his point. And then you read about some of the other things that he was doing. And it is hard not to come to the conclusion that this guy was essentially living out his own perverse sexual fantasies on his quote unquote research subjects. But the reason why I wanted to ask that question, because I know it's a difficult topic, but it's one of those things where it's going to happen. It is coming, right? You already see this. You already see this with it's already here in some capacity. but it's on the peripherals. And that's where people are looking at, well, yeah, okay, Nick, some people are saying minor attracted persons, but that's just some idiot in a university somewhere. I got news for you. All of this was some idiot in a university somewhere at one point, and now it's mainstream culture. And what I really want to encourage everyone in the audience right now, go check out The Sexual State by Dr. Morse, because she does a very, very good job of kind of taking people through and logically explaining that this isn't woo-woo, some crazy conspiracy theory or a secret cabal meeting someone. No, there were various reasons why people attempted to do these things, have largely been successful achieving them and making them culturally accepted, right? And it's not like everybody had the exact same motivation, right? And some of those motivations, if you use a smaller data set, it's like, oh, okay, well, maybe they were on to something, or maybe they were thinking about something when it came to population control, and they did. Okay, but the problem is that if you want to properly understand where we're currently at, if that is already confusing you, this is a great book to check out. But I would encourage you to take it a step further. And that is, I believe that Dr. Morse is absolutely correct when she says the issue is never the issue is the revolution. And it applies to this, and it applies to a number of other topics that we've discussed. But if you understand that, then what you need to realize is that means there's always something next. There is no point where it's like, okay, we've won, and now we can live in the nice aftermath of the world that we've created. It will never be enough. It will never be enough. I'm going to bring up this point, and it might seem a little off topic, but I hope you'll kind of understand what I'm talking about. And it lends a little stuff into the Marxist component, but this isn't just about Marxism. This is about a revolt against reality. Yep. And that can take on several different shapes. The name of the United States Army is the United States Army. It was the Continental Army. That was the original manifestation, the Continental Army. And then we won the revolution, and it became eventually the United States Army. Do you want to know what the name of the military is in China? It's the People's Revolutionary Army. But they won the revolution. Why is it still the Revolutionary Army? Why is it that every enemy is a counter-revolutionary? Because it's never good enough. There's always a new enemy. There's always some kind of new objective that is some sort of inherent revolt against reality. And there's always a new bad guy. And so if you haven't woken up yet to the idea that you're always going to be called a bigot, you're always going to be called some sort of name to otherize you, the moment you witness when things like this are going on and you say, I'm not going to accept that. I'm not going to accept this new normal you're attempting to create, because there's something fundamentally wrong with it. And in many cases, fundamentally evil with it. And I'm going to choose to stand as a bulwark against that. I'm not going to expose my children to it, whether it be what they look at on the internet, whether it be what's taught in their schools. I have a responsibility as a parent. I'm going to make sure that this doesn't happen to my kids. If we're not willing to take on that responsibility, if we're not willing to gain the knowledge of people that have done the research, have looked at it and presented a very, very well thought out, well-researched argument and explanation for where things are going, if we're not willing to then step up and say, what is my personal responsibility in this particular case to fight back against it, then you will get railroaded by it. And maybe you're fine with that, but you need to start asking whether or not you're fine if your kids get railroaded by it. And I would say that it is dark as what we've talked about, as dark as some of the topics are that we've talked about today, it needs to be discussed. But let me just end on a positive note. And this is also something Dr. Morse talked a lot about, is that it doesn't have to be this way. And if you look at it exclusively by this idea that how am I supposed to fight the World Economic Forum? How am I supposed to fight a major government apparatus? How am I supposed to fight a university system that is pushing all of this? I get it. It seems overwhelming, but you know where so much of this starts? What do you do in your own home? What do you do to take responsibility for the things that you do have control over, that you do have influence over? And I will tell you this much. I've been in the military. I've been in politics for 10 years. I've been an elected representative. Actually, I've been in politics for more than I've been an elected representative for 10 years. I've sat on the various committees. I've done those things. I've been in positions. And I will tell you this, I still go back to, I think long term, the greatest contribution I will have made will have been the fact that all three of my children are strong in their faith, strong in what they believe, strong in their sense of objective truth, objective reality, and objective morality, and are ready to go out and defend those things in a world that is increasingly hostile toward them. And so part of the trick here is they want you to get overwhelmed about all of the things that you can't control so you don't focus on the things that you can. Dr. Morse, thank you very much for being with us today. Real quick, tell people more about where they can find out about your work and the work that the Ruth Institute does.
Oh, well, thanks for having me, Nick. It was a blast, as I knew it would be. You can sign up for the Ruth Institute's newsletter, which we send out every week, by going to ruthinstitute.org. If you go to ruthinstitute.org, you'll find a blog with all of our articles on various topics. We have resource centers. We have a resource center for parents who are dealing with the trans issue, as a matter of fact. We have another whole resource center called Healing from the Sexual Revolution, where we have found ministries of people who are trying to help people deal with some of the different aspects that we've talked about. So that's where we are online. And you can also go to our YouTube channel, where we have a very, very lively, very active YouTube channel with interviews similar to this one, where every week I bring on a guest who knows something about the sexual revolution, either because they've lived through it themselves or because they have some kind of professional expertise, or they're an activist and they're trying to do something about it. So that's what you can find out about the Ruth Institute. And of course, you can buy The Sexual State. If you buy The Sexual State from the Ruth Institute, every book that comes out of this office, I autograph. So buy it from us and not from Amazon.
Well, that's again, that's great. I encourage everyone to rush over, check that out, sign up, subscribe on the social media channels. Once again, Doctor, thank you very much for being on, and thank you to everyone for watching. Definitely let us know what you think in the comments. Also, if you're interested in maybe recommending guests to us, consider joining our Circle community. You can find the link in the description. Once again, I'm Nick Freitas, host of Making the Argument. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.